Air war movies often fake what happens inside the cockpit. Lights flash, hands move randomly, dials spin without meaning. But a rare group of films chose a harder path. They rebuilt cockpits bolt by bolt. They respected pilot discipline, fear, and muscle memory. These films show aviation as it truly was. Claustrophobic, unforgiving, and deadly. This is the story of air war cinema that got it right. See number 12, The Battle of Britain, 1969. The Battle of Britain is not just a war film, it is an aviation document preserved on celluloid. When cameras enter the cockpits of Spitfires and Hurricanes, the film abandons drama tricks and embraces reality. Every gauge, every switch, every cramped movement reflects how Royal Air Force pilots actually fought for survival in 1940. Pilots do not shout heroic lines. They breathe heavily. They glance constantly between the sky and their instruments. Oxygen masks fog. Hands stay disciplined because one mistake means fire or a stall. The cockpit is not treated as scenery. It is treated as a weapon that demands respect. Instrument placement matches surviving airframes. Control yokes respond sluggishly under stress. Visibility is limited by thick canopy frames that pilots constantly fight against. What makes the cockpit realism shocking is how little is exaggerated. No impossible maneuvers, no magical awareness. Pilots lose sight of enemies, they miss calls. Radios crackle with confusion. Fuel levels are checked repeatedly because range anxiety defined the real battle. This film understands that aerial combat was not clean or cinematic. It was chaotic, exhausting, and frightening. Most importantly, the aircraft were real. These were not mock-ups or effects. These were living machines filmed in motion. That authenticity bleeds directly into the cockpit scenes. You feel the vibration through the controls. You sense the limited feedback pilots had. This is why modern pilots still praise this film. It respects the cockpit as a battlefield where silence, tension, and discipline decide who lives. Number 11, Tora, 1970. Tora remains unmatched in its obsession with procedural accuracy. The cockpit scenes are built from historical documentation, not imagination. Japanese, American, and British aircraft interiors were reconstructed using original manuals and pilot testimony. Every startup sequence follows real checklists. Nothing happens by accident. Inside the cockpits, pilots behave like trained professionals, not movie characters. Switches are flipped in correct order. Throttle movements are measured. Eyes move constantly between instruments and formation leaders. The film shows how much of air warfare is preparation, not combat. The tension builds before engines even leave the deck. Japanese aircraft cockpits feel cramped and restrictive, which matches historical accounts. Visibility is limited. Instruments are minimal. Pilots rely heavily on formation discipline and timing. American cockpits contrast with more readable gauges and different radio usage. These differences are shown visually rather than explained. The audience learns by watching behavior. Combat sequences maintain cockpit realism by limiting perspective. Pilots often do not know what is happening outside their immediate view. There is no omniscient awareness, only partial information and rapid decisions. Damage is not instant explosions. Controls stiffen, instruments fail, pilots react with confusion before panic sets in. This film treats the cockpit as a working office under extreme stress. It never glamorizes the space. It shows how much mental effort it took just to fly correctly. That commitment to accuracy is why Tora is still used as a reference by aviation historians today. And number 10, 12 O'Clock High, 1949. 12 O'Clock High captures the psychological truth of bomber cockpits better than any film before or since. Inside the B-17 cockpit, every movement reflects crew hierarchy and procedure. The pilot does not do everything. Each crew member has a role, and the film respects that structure. Checklists are followed even under fire. Engine temperatures are monitored constantly. Throttle adjustments are small and deliberate. This reflects the reality that bomber crews fought their aircraft as much as the enemy. Losing an engine did not mean instant heroics. It meant slow, careful problem solving while flak tore through the sky. Communication inside the cockpit feels authentic because it is restrained. Orders are short. Voices are calm by necessity. Panic is internal. The film understands that discipline kept crews alive. Hands shake, but procedures continue. This balance is what veterans praised most when the film was released. The cockpit is also portrayed as a place of isolation. Visibility is poor. Noise is constant. Oxygen masks muffle speech. The pilot relies on instruments more than instinct. When something goes wrong, the delay between action and result is terrifyingly real. 12 o'clock high avoids spectacle and chooses truth. It shows that bomber cockpits were factories of stress where leadership was measured not by bravery but by consistency. This realism makes the film timeless and deeply respected among aircrew historians. Number 9. The Right Stuff, 1983. The Right Stuff treats the cockpit not as a stage, but as a test chamber. Every aircraft interior in the film reflects the brutal reality of early jet and rocket flight. These cockpits are cramped, hostile, and unforgiving. There is no comfort and no margin for error. The film makes that clear from the first moment a pilot straps in. Inside the Bell X-1 cockpit, instrumentation is sparse and confusing. Gauges are small. Labels are hard to read. Pilots must memorize layouts because there is no time to search. This mirrors real test pilot conditions where visibility and workload pushed human limits. The film shows pilots trimming, manually wrestling the aircraft rather than guiding it smoothly. What makes the cockpit realism powerful is the sense of isolation. There are no sweeping exterior shots during critical moments. The camera stays inside with the pilot. You hear breathing. You feel the vibration. Control feedback is limited and delayed. When something goes wrong, the pilot has no immediate confirmation. That uncertainty defined early supersonic flight. The film also respects procedure. Checklists matter. Switches are thrown in correct sequence. Radio communication is brief and functional. There is no cinematic shouting, only controlled voices masking fear. The cockpit becomes a psychological pressure cooker where mistakes are permanent. The Right Stuff understands that these aircraft were experimental weapons pointed at the unknown. The cockpit scenes capture that danger honestly. This is why real pilots consistently praise the film. It shows that flying faster than sound was not heroic fantasy. It was calculated risk taken inside metal boxes barely capable of holding together. Number 8. The Blue Max, 1966. 1966. The Blue Max delivers some of the most physically accurate cockpit scenes ever filmed for World War I aviation. These aircraft are not machines of speed. They are fragile wooden frames held together by wire and faith. The cockpit reflects that reality at every moment. Pilots sit exposed to wind noise and vibration. Instruments are minimal and often unreliable. Control inputs require physical strength rather than finesse. The film shows pilots constantly adjusting pitch and rudder just to remain stable. There is no autopilot and no forgiveness. Visibility is both wide and dangerous. Pilots can see everything, but are also completely exposed. There is no canopy. Oil spray hits goggles. Wind tears at clothing. The cockpit becomes an endurance test as much as a control space. The film captures this with long, uninterrupted shots that force the audience to experience discomfort. Combat scenes avoid exaggeration. Turns bleed energy quickly. Aircraft stall unpredictably. Pilots fight their machines before fighting each other. This is historically accurate and rarely shown elsewhere. Dogfights feel desperate because they were. The Blue Max also understands pilot psychology. Cockpits are quiet between encounters. Pilots listen to engine tone for warning signs. They monitor vibration constantly. Fear comes from fragility, not speed. One snapped wire means death. By refusing modern cinematic tricks, the Blue Max preserves the truth of early air combat. These cockpits were not command centers. They were open graves held together by skill and nerve. Number 7. The Great Waldo Pepper, 1975. The Great Waldo Pepper captures aviation realism through obsession with vintage aircraft behavior. The cockpit scenes emphasize instability, unpredictability, and constant workload. These planes do not want to fly straight. Pilots must earn every second of control. Inside the cockpit, exposed wiring vibrates violently. Gauges bounce. Throttles resist smooth movement. The film shows how pilots used body weight, control pressure, and instinct rather than instruments alone. This reflects barnstorming era flying with terrifying accuracy. The camera often stays locked inside the cockpit during dangerous maneuvers. You see the pilot fight the aircraft rather than perform tricks. Loops feel heavy. roles feel forced, mistakes linger instead of vanishing instantly. This honesty separates the film from spectacle-driven aviation movies. Engine management is treated seriously. Over-revving has consequences. Pilots listen for subtle changes in sound. The cockpit becomes an extension of the pilot's senses rather than a control panel. This mirrors how early aviators survived without reliable instrumentation. The film also respects maintenance realities. Aircraft are unreliable. Cockpits smell of fuel oil and fear. Pilots understand that mechanical failure is always nearby. That tension lives inside every cockpit scene. The Great Waldo Pepper succeeds because it does not romanticize flying. It shows aviation as dangerous labor performed by obsessed individuals. The cockpit is not glamorous. It is a cage barely holding chaos at bay. Number 6, Dunkirk, 2017. Dunkirk approaches cockpit realism through restraint rather than spectacle. The Spitfire cockpit is presented as a confined survival space where information is limited and decisions are permanent. There are no digital overlays and no exaggerated movements. Everything is quiet, controlled, and terrifyingly real. Inside the cockpit, instrumentation is sparse and historically correct. Pilots rely on fuel gauges, compass readings, and engine sound rather than dramatic warnings. The film repeatedly emphasizes fuel management, which was one of the most critical factors for Royal Air Force pilots during the evacuation. Every glance at the gauge carries weight because running dry means drowning. Visibility is portrayed honestly. Thick canopy frames obstruct vision. Blind spots exist and are respected. Enemy aircraft vanish from sight unexpectedly. The pilot must constantly shift perspective, leaning forward and craning the neck. This physical struggle to see is a core part of the cockpit experience, and the film never ignores it. Oxygen use is handled with subtle accuracy. Masks are worn without explanation. Breathing is heavy and mechanical. Speech is limited and functional. Radio chatter is brief and sometimes unclear. This mirrors real combat conditions where clarity was rare and silence often meant danger. The camera stays inside the cockpit for extended periods, forcing the audience to experience isolation. There is no heroic music cue inside the aircraft, only engine vibration, wind noise, and breath. When damage occurs, instruments fail quietly rather than explosively. Control response changes subtly, creating tension without spectacle. Dunkirk understands that the cockpit is where fear truly lives. It respects pilot workload limitations and sensory overload. This commitment to realism makes the film deeply admired by modern aviators who recognize the truth in its silence. Number 5, Dark Blue World, 2001. Dark Blue World delivers one of the most authentic portrayals of Royal Air Force fighter cockpits ever filmed. The aircraft interiors are recreated with obsessive attention to detail, including canopy framing, instrument placement, and limited pilot visibility. Inside the cockpit, pilots behave like trained professionals rather than movie heroes. Hands move deliberately, eyes scan between sky instruments and mirrors. The film shows how quickly disorientation can occur in aerial combat and how easily pilots lose track of enemies even in clear weather. Radio discipline is portrayed realistically. Messages are short and sometimes missed. Confusion is common. Cockpit scenes avoid omniscient awareness and instead emphasize partial information. Pilots make decisions based on fragments rather than certainty, which reflects real combat conditions. The cockpit is shown as a physically demanding environment. Pilots strain against control forces during turns. Aircraft resist movement rather than obey instantly. G-forces affect breathing and awareness. The film avoids exaggerated maneuvers and instead focuses on sustained energy management. Damage is treated with realism. Instruments fail gradually. Controls stiffen. Smoke fills the cockpit slowly rather than dramatically. Pilots react with training, not panic. This discipline, grounded in procedure, makes the scenes believable and tense. Dark Blue World succeeds because it respects pilot psychology. Cockpits feel lonely even in formation. Fear is internalized. Survival depends on focus rather than bravado. The film captures the lived experience of foreign pilots fighting for a country not their own inside machines that barely protect them. Number 4. Memphis Belle, 1990. Memphis Belle stands out for its commitment to bomber cockpit realism during World War II. Inside the B-17 cockpit, the film emphasizes coordination procedure and constant mechanical stress rather than cinematic heroics. Every cockpit scene reflects accurate crew hierarchy. The pilot and co-pilot share workload. Engine controls are monitored continuously. Throttle changes are incremental and cautious. The film shows how bomber crews managed complex systems under relentless pressure. Intercom communication feels authentic. Voices overlap. Orders are repeated for clarity. Stress is audible but controlled. Oxygen masks distort speech and force brevity. The cockpit becomes a loud, crowded workspace where mistakes are costly. Engine failures are handled realistically. There is no instant solution. Crews diagnose problems slowly while maintaining formation. Instruments are watched closely for secondary failures. The tension comes from waiting rather than action. Visibility inside the cockpit is limited and frustrating. Frost forms on glass. Smoke intrudes unexpectedly. Pilots must rely on instruments when outside reference disappears. The film respects these limitations and never grants pilots impossible awareness. Memphis Belle understands the bomber cockpit as a factory of endurance. Crews survive through repetition, discipline, and mutual trust. The realism lies in how unglamorous the process feels. Victory is not explosive. It is achieved one checklist at a time. Number 3. The Dam Busters, 1955. The Dam Busters treats the cockpit as a place of precision rather than heroics. Inside the Lancaster bomber, flying is governed by discipline, repetition, and exact procedure. Emotion is controlled because it has to be. Accuracy is survival. The cockpit interiors mirror real operational aircraft with documentary restraint. Instrument placement is correct. Crew roles are respected. The pilot is not a lone figure of authority, but part of a tightly coordinated system. Navigation, altitude control, engine management, and timing are shared responsibilities, shown without simplification. Low-level night flying defines the tension. Pilots hold extreme altitude with almost no margin for error. Eyes move constantly between instruments and fleeting visual references outside the canopy. Corrections are small and deliberate. One mistake ends the mission and the crew. Communication is clipped and functional. Voices stay calm because rhythm matters more than courage. The film emphasizes rehearsal as a survival tool. Muscle memory replaces instinct when fear threatens control. Visibility is limited and unforgiving. Darkness erases depth perception. Pilots rely on instruments and trust their crew. When problems arise, responses are measured, not dramatic. The Dam Busters understands that bomber aviation was not spectacle. It was obedience to process inside a vibrating metal shell flying inches from disaster.
Number 2. Midway, 1976. The original Midway stands apart from later interpretations by grounding its cockpit scenes in real aircraft and real procedures. This film benefits from the use of authentic World War II planes rather than digital reconstructions. That authenticity defines every cockpit moment. Inside dive bomber cockpits, pilots manage altitude, airspeed, and targeting equipment with discipline. The film shows the stress of dive bombing through sustained cockpit perspective rather than dramatic cuts. Pilots wrestle aircraft during dives, and recovery requires strength, timing, and luck. Sighting equipment is portrayed accurately. Pilots align targets carefully rather than magically hitting enemies. Adjustments are small and deliberate. This reflects historical training and limitations of the era. Carrier operations are depicted with attention to cockpit detail. Takeoffs feel rushed and dangerous. Landings require precise throttle management and constant correction. Pilots rely on deck signals rather than intuition. Radio communication is chaotic and incomplete. Pilots miss calls. Orders overlap. Confusion dominates. This mirrors the historical reality of the battle where information arrived late or not at all. The cockpit realism extends to damage portrayal. Aircraft absorb punishment gradually, controls stiffen, engines lose power unevenly. Pilots react methodically rather than theatrically. Midway treats the cockpit as a place where battles are won through discipline and survival rather than spectacle. Its realism endures because it respects the limits of both machine and human. Number 1. Flying Tigers, 1942. Flying Tigers may be an early war film, but its cockpit authenticity remains impressive. This accuracy comes from direct involvement of real pilots who advised the production during active conflict. The P-40 cockpit is treated as a real working environment rather than a prop. Inside the cockpit, controls are handled with restraint. Pilots check instruments frequently. Throttle movements are careful. The film avoids exaggerated stick work and instead shows controlled, disciplined flying that reflects real training. Visibility limitations are respected. Pilots struggle to track enemies. Blind spots exist and cause mistakes. Cockpit framing obstructs vision and forces constant repositioning. This honesty grounds the combat scenes. Radio communication is simple and functional. There is no dramatic dialogue. Orders are brief. Confusion exists but is handled professionally. The cockpit becomes a place of focus rather than drama. The film also portrays mechanical vulnerability. Engines overheat. Controls respond unevenly. Pilots listen to their aircraft rather than rely on warnings. This reliance on sound vibration and instinct is historically accurate. Flying Tigers understands that early war aviation was still evolving. Cockpits were imperfect. Procedures were learned through experience rather than manuals. The film captures that uncertainty with surprising respect. Its realism may be understated, but it is genuine. This is why Flying Tigers still holds value as an aviation reference despite its age. These films did not chase spectacle, they chased truth. Inside their cockpits, fear, discipline, and skill collide in silence. No shortcuts, no fantasy, just human beings trusting fragile machines at the edge of survival. If you want air war cinema that respects pilots, reality begins here.